Visitors to Amsterdam are often struck by its tall, narrow buildings and the maze of canals that wind through the city. These waterways pass along charming streets with classic Dutch names like Ligenbaansgracht, Keizersgracht, and Damstraat. But beyond the busy tourist paths of the city center, in Amsterdam's Eastern District, you'll find something unusual. Streets here carry names that don't sound Dutch at all, like Ballenstraat, Sumatrastraat, and Borneostraat. This area is known locally as the Indies neighborhood, and its street names are a reminder of a distant past, when the Netherlands ruled over lands thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia. These lands made up what was once called the Dutch East Indies, much of which is now modern-day Indonesia. So how did a small European nation come to control islands over 7,000 miles away? The answer lies in one of the most powerful organizations in history, the Dutch East India Company. Founded over 400 years ago, the Dutch East India Company quickly became the richest company the world had ever seen. But this was no ordinary business. It had extraordinary powers, almost like a government of its own. It could wage war, imprison and execute criminals, negotiate treaties, mint its own coins, and even establish colonies. In many ways, it was the world's first multinational corporation, setting the blueprint for global trade and big business that still exists today. But what drove these Dutch merchants to risk everything and travel across the world on dangerous and uncertain journeys? To understand that, we have to go back in time. Before Amsterdam rose to become the heart of Dutch trade in the 17th century, the main centers of commerce in the region were the cities of Bruges and Antwerp. These cities attracted merchants from across Europe. Among them were the Portuguese, pioneers of global trade during the 1500s. They had built vast trading networks, stretching across continents, bringing valuable goods, especially spices, from the Far East back to Europe. At that time, the Netherlands, along with present-day Belgium and Luxembourg, was under the rule of the Spanish crown. Spain itself was closely tied to Portugal through a powerful dynastic union, forming part of the vast Habsburg Empire, the dominant force in Europe. But tensions were rising. The Dutch had largely embraced Protestantism, while their Spanish rulers remained deeply Catholic. This religious divide led to growing conflict, which eventually erupted into the Dutch Revolt in 1566, also known as the 80 Years' War. The Dutch were now fighting for independence. By 1591, things took another turn. The Portuguese, working with Spain and supported by powerful German banking families like the Fugger and Welser, began shifting their trade away from Dutch ports such as Antwerp and Bruges. Instead, they redirected it to the German city of Hamburg, cutting the Dutch out of the lucrative spice trade. And this decision would change everything. This move didn't just cut the Dutch out of the incredibly profitable spice trade, it also disrupted the entire global supply chain. The Portuguese simply couldn't keep up with the ever-growing demand for spices, and as a result, prices across Europe began to rise sharply. For Dutch merchants, this wasn't just a setback, it was an opportunity. Determined to fight back against what they saw as deliberate economic sabotage, they decided to enter the spice trade themselves and compete directly with the Portuguese. But there was one major problem. The Dutch had no idea where to go. The Portuguese closely guarded their secret sea routes to the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to follow. Undeterred, the Dutch worked in secret to obtain and verify these valuable nautical charts. Finally, in 1595, their efforts paid off. A fleet of 4 ships, led in part by Cornelis de Houtman, set sail for the unknown, heading toward Banten, the main pepper port in western Java. When they arrived in June 1596, they were met with hostility. Both the Portuguese and the local Javanese traders were wary of these new arrivals and refused to cooperate. The expedition struggled. Conflict broke out. Disease spread. By the time they decided to return home, half the crew was dead. And yet, they brought back just enough spices to turn a profit. It was a small success, but a hugely important one. Encouraged by this breakthrough, the Dutch tried again. In 1598, a larger fleet of 8 ships, led by Jacob van Neck, sailed east. This time, they reached the Maluku Islands, the true source of valuable spices like pepper and nutmeg. For the first time, the Dutch were able to trade directly at the source, cutting out middlemen entirely. When the ships returned to Europe between 1599 and 1600, The results were astonishing. A 400% profit. It was proof that enormous wealth lay waiting in the East. But there was a catch. These voyages were incredibly dangerous. Disease, piracy, and shipwrecks could wipe out entire fleets, and with them all invested money. For investors, it was a gamble where everything could be lost overnight. So the Dutch came up with a solution. Instead of funding one risky expedition at a time, they would pool their money together and invest across multiple voyages. That way, even if one failed, others could still succeed, reducing risk while maintaining high rewards. It was a revolutionary idea. In fact, the English had already adopted a similar model in 1600 with the creation of the East India Company. Not wanting to fall behind, the Dutch followed suit. In 1602, they founded their own powerful organization, the United East India Company, better known as the VOC. The VOC quickly expanded its presence in Asia. In 1603, it established its first permanent trading post in Banten. By 1611, another base was set up in what is now Jakarta. Soon after, this location became the company's main headquarters in Asia, renamed Batavia by its first Governor-General, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. While Cohen held authority in Asia, real power remained in the Netherlands, in the hands of a group of 17 major shareholders who controlled the company's direction. But the VOC wasn't alone in the East. The Portuguese were already there, and now a new rival had entered the stage, the English East India Company. By the 1610s, the English had built their own network of trading posts across the Spice Islands. Competition between the two companies quickly intensified. Tensions rose. And in 1623, that rivalry turned deadly. On the island of Ambon, VOC officials accused a group of men of conspiracy. What followed was brutal. 21 men were tortured and executed, 10 of them English traders. It was a shocking act that would leave a lasting scar on relations between the two powers and mark a dark chapter in the history of global trade. The executions were carried out on suspicion that the men were plotting to overthrow Dutch control and seize the trading post for themselves. The impact was immediate. The incident sparked a diplomatic crisis between England and the Netherlands, leaving deep resentment on both sides. Tensions lingered for decades and eventually became one of the key causes of the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652. But while conflict brewed in Europe, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, continued to expand across Asia. Although its primary focus remained the spice-rich islands of Indonesia, the company quickly built a vast and complex trade network stretching far beyond. VOC ships carried goods from the Netherlands to trading posts across Asia. There, these goods were exchanged for precious metals, especially silver and copper, from Japan. Those metals were then traded in powerful markets like Mughal India and Qing China for luxury items such as silk, cotton, porcelain, and fine textiles. These goods would either be traded again within Asia for spices, or shipped all the way back to Europe, where they could be sold for enormous profits. It was a global system, centuries ahead of its time. Much of the VOC's early success came at the expense of the Portuguese, whose dominance in the East Indies was steadily collapsing. One of the company's most remarkable achievements was gaining exclusive access to Dejima, a small artificial island off the coast of Nagasaki. For over 200 years, it remained the only place in Japan where Europeans were allowed to trade. The VOC's reach extended even further. In 1652, Jan van Riebeek established a resupply station at the southern tip of Africa. What began as a simple outpost would eventually grow into the Cape Colony, and later, the city of Cape Town. But the VOC wasn't just about trade. It also played a role in exploration during the Dutch Golden Age. In 1609, the company hired English navigator Henry Hudson to find a northeast passage to Asia through the Arctic. When ice blocked his path, Hudson turned west, hoping to find a new route through North America. Instead, he mapped large parts of the northeastern coastline and sailed up a river that now bears his name, the Hudson River. At its mouth, the Dutch would later establish the settlement of New Amsterdam, a city that would eventually become New York. Meanwhile, VOC explorers were also charting unknown lands in the southern hemisphere. Navigators like Willem Janszoon and Abel Tasman mapped large sections of Australia and New Zealand while searching for the mythical Great Southern Continent. By 1669, the VOC had reached the peak of its power. It was the richest private company the world had ever seen, commanding over 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, around 50,000 employees, and even a private army of 10,000 soldiers. Its investors were rewarded handsomely, receiving annual dividends as high as 40%. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. By the 1670s, growth had started to slow. Trade with Japan declined after the Japanese government restricted exports of precious metals, metals that were essential to the VOC's entire trading system. At the same time, competition from the English East India Company intensified. A series of Anglo-Dutch wars in the late 17th century further disrupted trade, cutting the flow of spices and goods into Europe. To stay ahead, the VOC adopted aggressive tactics. They flooded the market with spices like pepper, deliberately driving prices down to undercut their rivals. This strategy weakened the English, preventing them from gaining a strong foothold. But it came at a cost. Over time, the spice trade itself began to lose value. New competitors, like the French and the Danish, entered the market, increasing pressure on the VOC. Eventually, in 1684, the company was forced to shut down its major pepper trading hub in Banten. Desperate to adapt, the VOC tried to replicate its success elsewhere, including along India's Malabar coast. But the world was changing. European tastes were shifting. Demand for spices was declining, replaced by a growing appetite for tea, coffee, cotton textiles, and sugar. Unable to keep up with these changes, the VOC abandoned this new venture in 1721. And with that, the slow decline of a global giant had begun. In response to changing markets, the VOC made a bold shift. It moved away from the high-profit, low-volume spice trade, and entered the world of bulk commodities, goods that generated lower margins but could be sold in much larger quantities. But this new strategy came with a cost. To earn the same level of revenue, the company had to massively expand its operations. The VOC increased the size of its fleet and took on significant loans to secure precious metals from new sources, especially after losing easy access to Japanese silver. These metals were essential for buying goods across Asian markets. Between 1680 and 1720, the tonnage of ships returning from Asia increased by an astonishing 125%. But profits didn't keep pace. They rose by only 78%. The math was simple: more effort, less reward. This expansion drove operating costs higher and steadily reduced profit margins. Dividends to investors began to shrink. And yet, confidence in the company remained strong. In fact, during the 1720s, VOC stock prices reached an all-time high, proof that belief in its power had not yet faded. But reality was catching up. The rest of the 18th century marked a slow and steady decline. Some of the challenges were beyond the company's control. Trade within Asia began to weaken, and new, cheaper sources of goods, like sugar from the Caribbean and Brazil, undercut their profits. But many of the VOC's problems came from within. Corruption spread through its ranks. Leadership grew weak and ineffective. Financial mismanagement became increasingly common. And then came one of the darkest moments in its history. In 1740, rumors of an uprising among the Chinese community in Batavia triggered a brutal response. VOC forces, alongside local groups, unleashed widespread violence. Over 10,000 Chinese residents were killed. The massacre shocked the world. It severely damaged the company's reputation, not just in Asia, but back in the Netherlands. An official investigation was launched, and the Governor-General, Adrian Valkenier, was arrested. He would later die in prison before his trial could even begin. Despite all this, the VOC continued to operate on a massive scale. By 1780, it was still generating returns and remained a major global force. There were even plans to reform the company, to restore its former strength and prestige. But history had other plans. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War broke out, and it proved to be the final blow. Over the previous century, Britain had risen to dominance. The Royal Navy now ruled the seas, far surpassing Dutch power. During the war, British forces devastated VOC operations. Ships were captured. Cargo was seized. Key trading posts across the Cape Colony, India, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia were attacked and occupied. By the time the war ended in 1784, the Netherlands was financially crippled. The VOC was drowning in debt. Even though some territories were later returned under the Treaty of Paris, the damage was already done. The British secured trading rights in the Dutch East Indies, effectively destroying the VOC's last competitive advantage. There was no recovery. On March 1, 1796, the Dutch East India Company was officially nationalized by the Batavian Republic. After nearly 200 years, the world's richest and most powerful company had come to an end. A corporation that once ruled seas, commanded armies, and shaped global trade, had finally collapsed under the weight of its own ambition.